Raymond Delaney was the kind of father people trusted, and Ethan Delaney was the kind of son people admired, until one horrifying discovery turned their quiet suburban life into a national nightmare. What seemed like a tragic missing person case unraveled into something far darker, a hidden world of secrets, shame, and a murder so disturbing it shocked even the most seasoned investigators. Raymond Delaney lived in a modest two-story home on the edge of Omaha, Nebraska. The lawn was always freshly trimmed, the mailbox polished, and the shutters painted in a soft cream that matched the quietness of the neighborhood. He wore neatly pressed slacks, kept his shirts tucked in, and always gave a courteous wave to the neighbors during his morning jogs. Raymond wasn't rich, but he was comfortable. People described him as reliable, respectable, and devoted, especially devoted to his work, his routines, and above all to his only son, Ethan. Ethan was 19 and had just begun his first semester at a local college, majoring in computer science. He had inherited his mother's dark hair and quiet temperament. She had passed away 3 years earlier from a sudden illness, and since then, Raymond had taken on both parental roles. He cooked Ethan's meals, checked in on his homework, and even drove him to class when the bus was late. Their life, on the surface, was one of structure and care. Father and son eating dinner together at 6 p.m., watching nature documentaries on Fridays, and going to church every Sunday. To outsiders, their bond seemed unshakable. But while Raymond maintained a flawless image, Ethan's behavior had changed, in subtle ways. He was withdrawn, spending most of his time locked in his room, eyes glued to his laptop screen. He rarely spoke unless prompted and avoided phone calls, preferring text messages and online chats. Raymond chalked it up to grief, or perhaps the pressures of college. He didn't push too hard. After all, boys that age needed space. Still, there were moments when the distance between them was palpable, like two strangers who happened to share the same house. There were no loud arguments or dramatic fallouts. Instead, the silence grew heavier with time. Ethan's late night, routines, the locked bedroom door, and the fact that he never brought friends over created an atmosphere of quiet suspicion. Raymond began to wonder what was going on, but convinced himself it was just the modern age, kids and their secrets. He trusted his son, or at least tried to. At work, Raymond was known as meticulous and focused. He worked long hours, rarely took vacations, and kept his personal life separate from his professional one. But co-workers noticed he sometimes stared blankly at his monitor or missed small accounting errors. When asked, he'd say he was tired or distracted. In truth, his mind had begun to dwell more and more on the growing sense that something in his household wasn't right. Even with all his routines, his ironed shirts and clean-shaven face, Raymond felt something slipping through his fingers. The control he prided himself on was fraying, and he couldn't name exactly why. Ethan's silence became harder to ignore. The father who once confidently guided his son now stood on unsure footing, watching from a distance as the boy he raised became someone he no longer understood. Still, there were no signs of what was to come, no warnings, just a house that looked picture-perfect from the outside, hiding a storm quietly building within its walls. The turning point came on an ordinary Tuesday morning in late September. Ethan had left his laptop on the kitchen counter, complaining that it had been freezing up and running slow. In a rush to make his early class, he asked Raymond if he could take it to the local tech repair shop during the day. Raymond, ever the helpful father, agreed without hesitation. He placed the laptop in his briefcase, planning to drop it off during his lunch break. But curiosity got the better of him. As the hours passed, Raymond found himself thinking more and more about that laptop. He had always respected Ethan's privacy, or at least told himself he did. But lately Ethan had been so distant, so absorbed in whatever was on that screen. The silence, the late-night activity, the occasional locked door, it all added up to something he couldn't explain. By mid-morning, the urge to take a look had grown too strong to ignore. He shut his office door, pulled the laptop from his bag, and powered it on. At first, there was nothing unusual. A cluttered desktop filled with school folders, half-finished, essays and code files. But as Raymond dug deeper, He found a hidden folder buried within another, cryptically named System Cache. Inside, hundreds of files loaded onto the screen. Images, videos, text logs, all hidden from plain view. Raymond's hands began to tremble as he clicked through the contents. What he saw shook him to his core. The photos were explicit, unmistakably. They of Ethan, posed in various fetishistic scenarios. Some were masked, others were not. They featured costumes, restraints, and unusual props. The images weren't violent or illegal, but they were deeply personal, revealing a side of Ethan that Raymond had never imagined. And it wasn't just the photos. Ethan had created an entire online persona, managing a blog followed by thousands. There were captions, responses to comments, even direct messages. His son had been living a second life, carefully curated and hidden from the world that Raymond knew. It wasn't just the content that disturbed him, it was the deliberate secrecy. Raymond scrolled for nearly an hour, each new image eroding the trust he thought he had in his son. He wasn't prepared for this. The perfect son, the quiet college student, the boy he had raised with discipline and care, was exposing himself to strangers online in ways Raymond couldn't comprehend. It felt like betrayal. It felt like shame. And worst of all, it felt like something that reflected on him. He closed the laptop and sat motionless, staring at the desk in front of him. Thoughts spiraled. What would the neighbors think? What would the church say? Was it something he had done wrong as a parent? Guilt twisted into disgust, and disgust mutated into a cold, numb fury. From that moment, Raymond never looked at Ethan the same way again. He didn't speak of the discovery, he didn't confront him. Instead, he began to watch his son more closely, quietly studying his behavior, all the while pretending nothing had changed. But everything had. And deep inside, something in Raymond had started to shift, something dangerous, silent, and waiting. On the surface, the night of October 16th appeared no different from any other. The sun had set early, the air was crisp with the bite of mid-autumn, and Raymond Delaney followed his usual evening routine. He reheated leftovers from the night before, set 2 plates on the table, and waited. Ethan arrived just after 8 p.m., looking tired, carrying his backpack slung over one shoulder. He nodded at his father, mumbled a greeting, and made his way upstairs. He didn't come back down for dinner. That wasn't unusual anymore. Raymond ate alone slowly, barely tasting the food. The house was quiet, so quiet that every creak in the floorboards above sent a wave of tension down his spine. The earlier discovery on Ethan's laptop had not faded from Raymond's mind. If anything, it had festered, deepened into something far beyond anger. It wasn't just disapproval anymore. It had evolved into an obsession with restoring order, preserving the image of control he believed he had over his household. In his mind, his son's actions weren't just immoral. They were a threat, a stain on the legacy he thought he was building. And, more importantly, a danger to the illusion of perfection he had worked so hard to maintain. By 10 p.m., Raymond was no longer pacing or debating. His movements were calm, deliberate. He retrieved a fireplace poker from the living room, a long, heavy tool that had always stood neatly by the hearth. He wiped it clean with a towel and walked upstairs. The hallway was dimly lit. Ethan's door was closed, a faint blue light seeping from the gap beneath it. Inside, he was likely on his laptop again, perhaps editing more photos, maybe responding to strangers online. Raymond didn't knock. Investigators would later determine that there were no signs of struggle, no defensive wounds. The towel used to muffle Ethan's cries was found discarded under the bed. Raymond had struck with brutal precision, several blows to the back of the head and neck, ensuring there would be no chance for his son to fight back. It was quick, silent, and merciless. Once Ethan was dead, Raymond didn't panic. Instead, he wrapped the body in a tarp stored in the garage, dragged it down the basement steps, and placed it beside the old freezer that hadn't been used in years. Over the next few hours, he methodically cleaned the crime scene, scrubbing the floor, changing his clothes, and bagging every trace of evidence. He worked through the night, never once hesitating. There was no sign of remorse, no calls for help. To him, this was not a murder. It was an erasure, a correction. By morning, Raymond left the house and drove to work as if nothing had happened. He greeted his co-workers, sipped his coffee and answered emails. To those around him, he was the same quiet, organized man they had always known, but in his basement, hidden behind a locked freezer lid, lay the dark truth of what he had done. And no one suspected a thing. Ethan's disappearance was first noticed by his professors. After missing 2 classes and failing to submit an assignment, a concerned email was sent to his student account. When there was no reply, the college contacted Raymond. Calm and collected, Raymond explained that Ethan had mentioned feeling overwhelmed and might have taken a few days to clear his head. He assured them his son was fine, probably staying with a friend, and promised to check in. The university accepted, the explanation without suspicion. A few more days passed, and Ethan's absence grew harder to ignore. Friends from school began to send messages, most of which went unread. A classmate who had worked with Ethan on a recent group project tried calling him, but the number went straight to voicemail. Concern spread slowly, quietly, until finally one of Ethan's classmates reached out to police and filed a missing person report. That's when the questions began. Raymond didn't hesitate to answer when officers showed up at his door. He invited them inside, made coffee, and repeated the same story he had told the university. Ethan had been stressed. Maybe he left to clear his head. Maybe he didn't want to be found. He even handed over an old photo for the missing person flyer. The officers noted his composed demeanor. There were no signs of forced entry or foul play. The house was clean, orderly. Raymond came across as a concerned parent trying to stay strong. He printed posters, joined the local search efforts, and gave short interviews to a local news station. Neighbors praised his strength and dedication. To the public, Raymond was a grieving father, desperately searching for his son. But the truth was that behind the scenes, he was carefully maintaining a lie. The unraveling began from a place he hadn't anticipated: the internet. One of Ethan's anonymous online followers noticed that he had suddenly stopped posting. No new content, no responses to messages. This follower, a curious and tech-savvy individual, began to investigate. They used metadata, IP address tracking tools, and old online breadcrumbs to find out where Ethan might have been posting from. After some digging, they traced the source of the blog activity to a location that matched Raymond's home address. That's when they contacted a private investigator. The investigator, intrigued by the strange coincidence, confirmed the findings and handed the information over to the authorities. When the police obtained a search warrant, they returned to Raymond's home with a very different tone. This time, they didn't ask, they searched. What they found shattered the illusion. In the basement, they discovered traces of blood in the floorboards, missed during Raymond's initial cleaning. Behind a locked freezer, they found garbage bags containing Ethan's remains, dissected, labeled with dates, and wrapped in plastic. Forensics quickly matched the blood to Ethan. Even more damning was the digital trail. Ethan's blog had been accessed multiple times after his supposed disappearance from Raymond's computer. Attempts had been made to delete some files, but the forensic team recovered enough to prove that Ethan's online identity had been manipulated post-mortem. The final piece was a handwritten notebook hidden in a locked drawer filled with chilling entries. Phrases like, "He needed to be silenced," and "This is the only way," painted a clear picture of intent. The man, once admired for his composure and devotion, was now at the center of a horrific crime, and the community that had once respected him began to ask, who was Raymond Delaney really? Raymond Delaney's trial began 6 months after his arrest and quickly drew national attention. The courtroom was packed with reporters, community members, and true crime enthusiasts following every detail. The man who had once been viewed as a pillar of moral uprightness now sat in an orange jumpsuit, expressionless and silent, as the prosecution laid out the evidence. It was overwhelming. Blood samples, digital footprints, the freezer in the basement, and the journal filled with disturbing thoughts. But what shocked the public most wasn't the brutality of the crime, it was the revelations that came afterward. As investigators continued combing through the Delaney home, they uncovered encrypted hard drives, hidden in the floorboards beneath Raymond's bedroom closet. Once cracked open, the contents painted a disturbing picture of his private life. Dozens of anonymous profiles, memberships to online fetish communities, and message threads stretching back years were all traced back to Raymond himself. The usernames on those forums matched some of the ones that had commented on Ethan's blog. Some had even sent direct messages to Ethan, messages investigators confirmed originated from IP addresses linked to Raymond's own devices. This new evidence shifted the narrative dramatically. It was no longer simply a story about a father horrified by his son's hidden lifestyle. It was a story of projection, of self-loathing, and of a desperate attempt to bury something inside himself that he couldn't accept. The prosecution argued that Raymond hadn't killed Ethan out of pure disgust, but out of fear that his son's openness would bring to light the same tendencies he had spent a lifetime hiding. Ethan was, in a tragic way, a reflection of the very identity Raymond had tried to suppress. Psychological evaluations revealed a man torn between the image he presented to the world and the truth he kept locked inside. From an early age, Raymond had buried his desires, choosing instead to embrace rigid ideals of morality, religion, and control. His marriage had followed this pattern of repression, and after his wife's death, the facade only grew stronger. Ethan's blog wasn't just embarrassing to him, it was a threat. The discovery shattered the illusion he had spent decades maintaining. The trial ended with a guilty verdict. Raymond was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge described the act as not only a murder of the body, but a murder of truth and identity. As the media frenzy faded and the town tried to return to normal, the deeper tragedy of the case remained. A young man was killed not for harming anyone, but for daring to be honest in a world that still punishes difference. The aftermath left a scar on the community. People began to question how well they really knew the people around them. Schools held forums on mental health and identity. Support groups formed for families struggling with generational conflict and secrecy. Ethan's story became a symbol, not just of loss, but of the consequences of silence, shame, and the destructive power of pretending. Raymond Delaney, once a man admired for his discipline and devotion, would now be remembered for something else entirely, a symbol of how deeply darkness can hide behind the mask of perfection.